Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is time for history. All of you sit down, shut up, and learn things. At this point, well, am I wrong? At this point, I hand over to our expert on such things, MC.
Thanks, Jensen. I don't think that I was as harsh as you are when you say that sit down and shut up, because I'm hardly perfect with some of this stuff. But you and I had discussed maybe doing Thomas Jefferson next, but I think that before we do Thomas Jefferson, before we really go into the man and everything else, I think today what we'll talk about is society, the colonial society as a whole at this time, because there's a lot about this that people don't even understand, right? That people today, you can't even conceive what life was like, and there's a lot of myths surrounding a lot of this,
Yeah.
And I want to talk about some typical things, right? And I'm going to talk right off the bat, and let's take a look here, if you don't mind. Let me share my screen here. I should have had this up earlier, so I apologize.
No problem.
All right. Well, let me stop sharing and share it again. For some reason, it does this the first time when I share this screen.
Hello, Miss Murder.
Hi, Miss Murder. How are you doing? Now, this is from a children's website, just to let you know, of what they consider typical colonial dress, right? And we're going to go into more than just the dress, but I want to point, the clothing. But I want to point these things out, right? So you end up with the fabulous tricorn hat that we all have heard about. A cravat, which most people don't even know what the hell a cravat even is, right? A waistcoat, a coat, breeches, stockings, and then of course these shoes, right? And they're saying this is typical man, okay? Typical male clothing, and this is what we've all seen, all right? If you take a look at all the colonial pictures that they talk about in schools and everything. Good morning, Jacob. All right. They all mention this. They all bring this about, right? And for women, it was dressed like this. The little petticoats, a shift, a hat, a little gown. The stockings were underneath there, and the shoes were in many cases like the men's. All right, in that they show that this part here, where I want to talk about this. In actuality, most of the men's shoes were probably a little bit heeled. All right, a little bit. All right, as were the women's. They weren't what we call high heels, but they were heeled shoes. Right.
Yeah.
Now, this I see MC is pregnant. Not quite. The thing about this is it's nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay, this is not the typical dress. And there's reasons why people believe this and so forth, okay? But this was not typical Americana, all right? If you want to know what typical Americana was, all right? Oh, this is another one, all right? If it wasn't for that, the woodsmen, or the frontiersmen, look at this. All right, now, the first thing that's true about this is, see how this guy's footwear is? This is probably pretty close to what the average footwear was. Nothing really big, nothing, fanciful, just basically some leather strapped around your foot, right? That's very, very true, right? This kind of style was probably pretty prevalent, and underneath there were wool socks. But when did you see a woodsman running around with white?
Yeah.
Okay,
you guys like to take the Mickey. Sorry, you guys like to take the Mickey out of us for wearing red. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to tell me?
Yeah. There's no white here. There's no woodsman that's going to run around in white. What, do you find a white deer? Right? How many white deer are roaming around the forest, folks? Okay, this didn't happen. What people were dressed like is this. And this is a well-dressed man on the average scale. Note, his hat is not a tricorn hat. It's just a simple hat. Okay? It's a simple, look at this. This isn't really a shirt, is it? No, this is more basically, a blanket, like a poncho, right, where they created sleeves out of it, and then they did this. This is what typically you would have, right? This kind of stuff. This was the typical farmer. And you got to remember, back then, farmers were typical. 90% of Americans, 90% of the colonials were engaged with their hands in agriculture. They were not the city dwellers. They were not the coopers. They were not, all right, the tailors, the sail makers. Okay, they weren't the silversmiths. Yes, silversmiths exist. Printers existed. People like Benjamin Franklin. They did exist. I'm not denying that. But the average American, that wasn't their life. That wasn't colonial life. This was closer to their colonial life. Right? This, all right? I don't know if you can see this too well. Let me blow this up a little bit here so you can take a look at it. This is what people wore, all right? This is a typical farmer's gear, all right? It's nothing fancy, all right? Although, once again, it probably wouldn't have been white because it would have been dirty, okay? The typical farmer, all right, in America, the typical man and woman in America had two sets of clothing. Their work clothes that they wore every day, and then their Sunday dress that they took care of. Right? Yeah. The clothes in America, all right, vary greatly from the north to the south. Why? Because those people who don't know, the temperature in the Northeast is a hell of a lot different than the temperature in the South. Okay? You are not going to be roaming around the countryside in South Carolina, right, in heavy dress, in heavy clothing.
Well, it's not for long. Let's be fair. You may find some geniuses that want to, but I think we like to call them Corpse 1 and Corpse 2.
Yeah, basically, yes. All right. And so there was more of a premium for certain types of cloth in the South versus what was in the North. All right. For different reasons. In the North, you basically were seeing some type of tanned leatherware in most cases. It's not saying that you didn't see the gentlemen, right, with the tricorn hats and so forth, right? The other thing that I think people don't understand about America, all right, and we were talking about this, last week, is the idea of a middle class. Okay, within the structure of the United States, the people who were the cobblers, the people who were the for lack of a better term, the city dwellers, right? These are people that had skills, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, right? These are people that were the skilled. MC, it's current year, don't dress me. All right. These were also people, all right, that came within a generation or two from those farmers, right? From those dirt poor farmers, right? So they would, the farmer would have on average 6 to 7 children.
Yeah.
Okay. There were obvious exceptions, right? But generally 6 or 7 children. All right. And the children were looked upon, okay, as labor. Yes, they were your children. Yes, you loved your kids. That family unit, everything, yes, that all applies. But the children were also labor. Okay, they were also there to help work the farm. But if a farm gets too large, if there's family's too large, right? Then either you have to expand the farm, or you're going to have to find something else that your children can do, right?
Please don't say sell your children. Please don't say sell your children.
So now, there's another aspect of this that we'll talk about in a little bit when I go on to another slightly different subject, right? But the child, if the child is at a certain level, all right, and you have enough kids to help you with the farm, but you're struggling because, well, there's not enough food, all right, what you try to do, and what they often did, is they would apprentice their children, right, to the townsfolk, okay, and you would become an apprentice. Normally around the age of 7 to 10, all right, you would get apprenticed, right? Now, the apprentice methodology was something that had been, obviously a staple in Britain, right? I mean, it was brought over in Europe as a whole, actually, right? To where if you're going to learn a trade, you would first become an apprentice, and then you'd become a journeyman before you were allowed to become a craftsman, all right, via the guild method, all right. The advantage of being in America is once you became a journeyman, generally people, you basically could just walk away, right, and start your own business, right, because you had the space, you had areas to move into. For example, all right, you had Benjamin Franklin. Now, he was apprenticed, all right, to his uncle initially, all right, basically kind of fled because he decided that he wanted to leave. He left, actually went to Britain before he came back to really flesh out his career. But when he came back, he wasn't necessarily considered a craftsman, but because he already had the skill set, all right, people weren't going to question that were you approved by a guild. This is why guilds never took off in America, because they just couldn't, they couldn't afford it, right? While in the early colonial days, they couldn't, beggars can't be choosers, right? So this begins this entire sequence of how all these things work. This is how all this stuff is working. Complete different mindset and lifestyle, right? And these clothes that you are seeing, okay, many of these people don't realize this, but the clothes themselves were regulated. What you could wear was regulated. For example, they had laws that if your property, right, and this is in the Puritan area, right, if your property wasn't worth 200 pounds, right, you weren't allowed to have a suit that had gold buttons or silver buttons. So your Sunday clothes couldn't have gold and silver in them, right?
Wow.
Right. Just understand the mentality of how that worked, right? There was kind of an odd mixture, right, within the Puritan mindset, all right, and within the aristocratic mindset as well. Women, for example, were not. If you were not a woman of stature, you weren't supposed to be sporting, okay, what was obviously a high class dress. That wasn't part of your station. You weren't supposed to be there, right? Now, in America, it wasn't as bad simply because it couldn't afford to be. For example, one of the problems with saying, well, how much is your land worth, is, well, your family might be worth a lot of money one week, and the next week, because of for whatever reason, even the fact that you had a bad windstorm come over there and wiped out your freaking grain crop, right? Mm-hmm. You could go from being qualified to it for not to be destitute, and then so they started writing in laws that, well, you were authorized this at one time, so therefore your family and everything can continue to dress that same way, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being forced to dress down. But you'll notice in the Puritan mindset, it had to do they attached it to how much money you had, right? Not your pedigree, not who you were born from. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons for that. All right, and the reason is because when you went to America, okay, as a British or a Dutch colonialist, and even French to some degree, when you came to America, nobody cared if you were a lord or a lady, because it had nothing to do with whether or not you were going to survive. Okay, you were out in the wilderness.
True.
Right? It doesn't matter if you come back and go, I am Baron so and so. Yeah, tell that to the bear. You know, tell that to the mountain lion and the pack of wolves. Did you a lot of good, Baron? Huh? Kind of sucked, didn't it? Right? That mindset, right, was completely different. Okay. The lords and ladies of those time frames didn't have the same kind of context. And what's more is many of the people that came over initially, right, in the early colonial days, they were coming over as slaves and indentured servants. Okay, not necessarily as free men and free women. And an indentured servant, and this is something that irritates me now because no one even talks about the indentured servitude anymore. All right. The indentured servants today, all right, what people don't understand is they came over and they were basically on a contract to be slaves for a certain period of time. Right, depending upon how they were done. They were serfs. They were effectively serfs that were sold into slavery, all right, for a variety of reasons, right? Back in the old world, came over to America and had normally at least 10 years, all right, that they had to work as a slave, right? Oftentimes it was longer than that even. And then after those 10 years were up, after those 15 or 20 years were up, then you were allowed to be free. Okay? And so, but that didn't necessarily give you anything. Okay? In some cases, they put in the thing saying, okay, you'll be given, 40 acres and a mule kind of mentality, right? That you can work on your own. But in reality, these guys came over and they were just looking for the opportunity of saying, okay, I can stake out my own land and this will be my land as I go out in the wilderness and I cut down these trees and I build my log house and I build my land, right? I cut out my territory, right? That's going to be my land that I'm going to farm on my own. And they were treated like slaves.
Yeah.
And in fact, in 1676, you have what's known as the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia. Now, the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, right, was led by a black slave called, I believe his name was Roger Bacon, right? And he led a group of slaves. Well, he didn't just lead a group of slaves. He led a group of slaves / indentured servants. There were a whole lot of white indentured servants that were part of his rebellion. Now, it was brutally, and I mean brutally suppressed.
I'm going to say this because I have to, really. And I may well get in trouble for this, but what the hey? You mean there was such a thing as white slavery? How can you say that? Such things don't exist. I mean, good God, white man invented slavery. There was never such a thing. Okay, I can't even carry that on.
Slaves, all right, have been a staple of human. We're a staple of humankind until recently, folks. People don't even understand this. Slaves were a staple of humankind. All right, up. You always had slaves. In fact, being a serf was, they considered you one step above a slave, but in reality, you were a slave.
I would like it noted, What MC is calling a slave over here, we call McDonald's workers. Carry on.
But the ideas behind that and how people were treated, people were whipped. What do you think about the new Glenn legislature? Legislation, you mean? We'll see. We'll see when it passes. We'll see what they're able to put together when they go through with it, because I don't think it's got a chance of passing. But if you take a look at, and the fact is it's total nonsense. It's all bullshit anyway. But if you take a look at that time frame with the way people were treated, you were whipped. You were horribly whipped. People don't even understand what was acceptable as a freeman. Sailors that were traveling the oceans at that time, right, were subject, all right, to captain's law.
Yeah.
And now the reality is that a captain who was overly brutal had a bad time finding people that would serve under him. But all the captains, flogging was very much a common practice back then. Right? What I mean by common practice is not everybody was flogged. That's not what I'm saying. Right? But flogging wasn't unusual during a cruise, during an expedition.
Yeah.
Right? There were going to be people that were flogged for a variety of different reasons, for a variety of small infractions on the ship. It was going to happen. Right? Everybody knew that this was going to happen sooner or later, that somebody was going to step over the line. Right? And get caught. So to look at that society today, and people can't even recognize it. If you were caught not going to church, this is something that was very true in the Puritan North. Sunday, you went to church. You went to church. It was illegal for you to skip going to church. Okay. Right now, this is a different. Trust me, this is completely different. And I don't think Europe ever had anything like that, right?
No.
To where if you failed to go to church, they would come find you.
Though actually, you say that, okay? There are villages over here that, I'm not joking. If you don't go to church, I mean, I'm not saying that they are going to drag you down there, but you would be considered the pariah of the village, and that's if you was liked. And ATM.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So you had to go to church, and you didn't have the kind of blue laws back then as far as drinking went, and there's a reason for that too. We'll get to that, right? But there were certain things you were expected to do in society, and if you stepped out of the societal norms, there were punishments for you.
Yeah.
And they would put you in stocks. People forget, they think that the stocks are something that came over from Europe, and it did, but at the same time, they think that it was unusual in America. No, in the early colonial days, right, stocks were normal, right? If you did something outside the norm, all right, or outside of what was, socially proprietary, they would put you in the stock. They would put you in stocks. And what would happen is they would block you in the stocks in the town square. They would announce what your sin was, for whatever it was, right, to the populace, and then the populace would decide whether or not they were going to mock you, ignore you, shame you, throw dirt on you, throw freaking shit on you, okay, or whatever.
I'm so glad you actually mentioned the fact that it wasn't just the rotten vegetables rubbish.
No.
They would literally beat them as they walked past. They would attack them physically.
They would spit on them. Sometimes they would slug them. All right. Now, normally, all right, that was reserved for men only, right?
Yeah.
but it's that they did have things that they could put, and people, there were women that were placed in the stocks, but the society generally tolerated different aspects of. They would tolerate things from women and not tolerate things from women at a time frame, right? Mainly because, quite frankly, men were expendable. Okay. Yeah. And the reality is that your city, your town, and everything can continue, all right, with just a few men, all right, and as long as there's lots of women, because, well, quite frankly, they can have kids, right? Yeah. So new firearm laws, the unreasonable taxes. All right, but this was a different time frame. There are an issue with when we're talking about clothing and how some of the laws were. Women were prohibited, all right, for example, from flaunting wealth, right? Well, this woman in Connecticut was charged with flaunting wealth because she dared to come out with a silk scarf in public.
Shock. Horror.
Right? Now, this woman tended to be typically American. She was like, you're going to sit up there and go after me and bring me in front of the court for wearing a silk scarf. So she wore the silk scarf to the court. The judge was unamused.
Wow. That's subtle. Yeah, go on.
Right. And so did he put her in stocks? No, he fined her, and obviously fined her husband, but that's really all it was a fining thing. Now, and the reason that they were doing that is they didn't want people to, in the Puritan sense, because the idea was equality even back then under the law.
I agree with TM for this.
Well,
the iniquities are quite extreme.
The iniquities for sentencing, all right, are not. They have other dynamics that are a part of this.
True.
Right? That we're not talking about it from that sense. I mean, these were laws that were put in place that said you can't flaunt wealth. Right now, as the colonies established themselves and became prosperous. Right. Obviously, a lot of those laws and everything were ignored. They weren't necessarily gotten away from, but they were ignored. Right. But the idea that the people have of colonials and what colonial life was like, it's completely different. And when I was talking, I mentioned this before when we were talking about the middle class. The middle class were in America. Were not the same idea of what the middle class was in Europe.
No.
Okay? And the difference is many of the people that were in the trades and in what we call the middle class in the United States were people that less than a generation, often before, right, their families were farmers. Dirt poor farmers. Okay. The idea that there was a social structure there, right, based on the aristocratic totality of life, right, the way life was, didn't exist. It wasn't the same thing. You were sure. Your father could be a tradesman, and then it was more likely you would be a tradesman, and you would, like, if your father was a blacksmith, it's very likely that you would learn blacksmithing skills coming up and so forth. That was all true. But it was just as true that you may not have that guy that's a blacksmith, his father may or may not have been a blacksmith. Why? Because they needed blacksmiths, all right, and where they didn't need somebody on the farm because somebody had too many mouths to feed, his family probably, was just as likely that he grew up on a farm and became a blacksmith out of necessity when his family basically apprenticed him to the blacksmith because he wasn't necessary on the farm. Now, one of the other things that was happening on the farms, right, and back in basically throughout the society back then was illness and epidemics were the norm. People were dying of cholera every year. And why was that? Well, that was because, quite frankly, this was the norm for your toilet. Well, actually, this wasn't. Right? This, and as soon as just grab my screen here, is a chamber pot. Okay? Now, chamber pots were where you, when nature called and you had to crap and you had to pee, you went into a chamber pot in the middle of winter. Why? Because it's freaking cold and nobody wants to run outside. This was at the farmhouse, all right? Nobody wanted to run outside where the little shed was that you shit in. Okay? In town, you probably didn't even have a shitter because you go in these pots, and this here is an expensive pot. Most of the pots were like this. All right? You were peeing and pooping in a bucket. And it was typical that you would then take this refuse at some point during your day and empty it. All right. Now, where did you empty it? Well, most people would try to empty it away from their house, right? If you were in a city, right? You also eventually had some of the areas build these in their houses. But although this isn't really typical, to be honest. This right here just shows, okay, well, what's here? Well, many times the chamber pots were underneath these little stools and shit, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what they had going. This is where sanitation was. This is what sanitation was like. So you didn't want to get it away from your house. So where did you dump it? Well, you dumped it outside of town most of the time, right? Or you dumped it in your neighbor's lawn if you didn't like your neighbor, right? This is what people forget. People today are no different than they were back then. If you didn't like somebody, well, just so happened that some shit may end up on their front door, right?
Yeah.
In 1725, for example, the city of what becomes the city of New York, all right, issued a decree to tell people to stop just emptying their shit out on the street. They made it mandatory because that's the other thing they would do. They would just take it outside as long as it's far enough away. Boom. These cities smelled. Yes. Right? And like I said, in 1725, the city of New York said, no more. You have got to take your crap outside the city. You had to either dump it in the river where people were getting their water to drink.
I love that logic. That's just glorious. But yeah.
All right. You were dumping it in the river or the stream or somewhere, but you weren't going to dump it in the city anymore because the cities were stinking in high heaven. And who was cleaning the cities and these things up? Well, most of the time they let it rain and clean it up. But when they really, if it came to a point, what they would do is they would basically issue decrees to the local populace to supply somebody, normally an indentured servant or a slave, to go through the city and clean it up. Now, they then would take it out to the farmers, and the farmers would basically use it for their crops. The people that had gardens would normally take their chamber pots and they would dump it in their gardens. Right? This was typical. This was typical of life. So disease was rampant. Right? We take so much for granted. You did not have sewer systems, all right, in people's houses. You did not have sewers, all right, until and sewage systems and septic systems until way past the colonial era, and you start talking about the 1800s, in the mid 1800s.
You might want to mention that this is back in the time where there was no iPods, you're going to confuse a lot of people on this because they probably think that actually was from the past. And the thing is, I'm not actually joking with this.
And why am I bringing all this up? Well, because today's society and how we function in society is totally different. Okay, if you want to live together in a collective and everyone's throwing their shit out their windows, you're not going to live very long in those areas, right? It's because it's just going to turn into a cesspool. So you had to take the social responsibility, and it was a social responsibility of taking your crap outside and outside the city. The Native Americans, people don't even understand this, but the Native Americans, when the first American cities started to rise up, started calling the Americans shit sitters, started calling the colonialists shit sitters. Why? Because their cities smell like shit. The Native Americans at the time always moved around. Why? Because when they would go to an area, they would, even the ones that were engaging in agriculture to a point, like the Iroquois, sure, they would engage in agriculture for a year, maybe two, and then they would move. Why? Because their area started to smell like shit. So they would move the tribe. The tribe would basically move to another area. Now, this had an interesting effect of, okay, well, you're letting the land then go fallow and so forth and let it recover and things like that. So it kind of created a better dynamic cycle for agriculture in that regard. But the Native Americans never understood the average person. And when people talk about bathing and things, people didn't bathe back then. Why? Where did you get the water from? It didn't come in your house. You didn't walk over to the kitchen sink, right, and turn the spigot on. There were no spigots. There was no indoor plumbing. Okay? You had to go out with a bucket and go out there and bring buckets of water. Your first part of the day for many people after they did their initial business was as the day would start. If you were a woman, a good portion of your day was going down to the local watering hole and getting water. Going down to the stream with a couple of buckets and putting them on there and walking back. And you probably had to do it more than once if you got your family of 6. Your life is not the life of leisure that we have today. Now, normally what they would do, I hate to tell you this, but normally what these guys would do is they would go out, throw their crap in the river, all right, and then go with the buckets, fill the buckets up, and go back. All right? You didn't have baths. People weren't taking baths once a week. And I'm not talking just the farmers. The farmers were more likely to wash and stuff because more than likely there was a watering hole that they would just dip themselves in very quickly if they felt like the need to do so, right? So it was normally they would have a stream fairly close by that they could easily wash themselves. And they didn't wash their clothes either. Now, why was that? Well, quite frankly, when you wash clothes, go inside of a washing machine and take a look of how a washing machine works. A washing machine basically is scrubbing by beating your clothes, right? There are paddles down there that rotate the clothes and smack the clothes, and the clothes are hitting things going back and forth. Well, all of that damages the cloth, right? The more you wash the cloth, the thinner it would become. It would become more threadbare. It would become less useful. Now, for the majority of the Europeans, because of the way their system had already been fully developed, the durability of cloth wasn't a huge issue. But in America, it was a major issue. So, as long as your clothes are, when you only have one set of clothes for your work clothes and another set for your for Sunday clothes, right? How often did they get washed? Well, they probably would do things like a spring cleaning and a fall cleaning, and that was maybe twice a year would your clothes get washed. When your family went out to take a bath, right? When you decided to have a family bath, it was a family bath. They would fill the bathtub one single time, and everyone would use the same bath water. The only difference is they may or may not heat it again.
Well, try this one for a laugh. Assuming you all know who Queen Elizabeth I was, which, you probably do, she was known to have said, and I quote, "I have a bath once a year, whether I need it or not."
Yes. That was
so much, doesn't it?
That was all of society as well, right?
Yeah.
There's an interesting study actually that was done by a group that had a 1 year wash policy, right? And the families during a certain part of the year would go out for their family wash, right, on that year. And it just so happens that 9 months later were when most of the births would take place. Something about climbing into the bed with your spouse and they don't stink kind of appealed to people. All right. We don't know why.
Yeah, can't imagine.
But it just shows you the dynamic, the difference in the dynamics of how society was back then. Our society today has so many things that we can't even understand the attitudes of the people and this was their daily lives. Okay. This way he has to be understood. This was their daily, everyday life. Every day you were getting up and you had a bucket of shit to throw out. Okay. You then had to carry water to your house. All right. You every day, every single day, you needed to do this to survive. Oh, you could skip a day here and there, and then your house smelled like, all sorts of crap. Now, where do they keep the chamber pots? Well, many people kept the chamber pots right under their beds.
Yeah. Right?
Why? Because, if it's freaking, blowing snow outside, can you imagine that? Can you imagine the fact that you got a chamber pot under your bed, you just shit and you just pissed in it, right? It's in the middle of the night. And you're going back to sleep with that smell. And it's going to permeate your bedding. It's going to permeate your clothing, right? Does this surprise anybody that the Native Americans thought of the whites as shit sitters?
I should point out it was believed that the smell of urine coming from the chamber pots under the bed was actually good because it would kill off the various bugs and things in the bed.
There was that philosophy, yes.
Yes.
And it's not that these people were stupid, all right? So they're ignorant. They don't have a lot of things. A lot of the understanding of disease and so forth that we have today didn't exist back then. A lot of our understanding of the natural universe around us didn't exist back then. And why am I bringing this out? Because I want people to understand what life was like for everybody else before we start talking about things like slavery. Slavery was not looked upon the same way as it is today, right? And the reason I'm not justifying slavery. Don't get me wrong. It's just that people thought slavery was it would be bad to be a slave, but not like we do today. Not the abhorrence that we had. People did not have the abhorrence of slavery that we have of it today that they had back then. It was not the absolute worst thing that could happen to you. The way they looked at life, being a slave was not the worst thing that could happen to you. There were things that were much, much worse. All right. To be a criminal, all right, to was looked upon in an entire different manner. If you were a murderer and people thought of you as a murderer, you were looked upon worse than a slave. There's a lot of slaves that would have said, look, if we can be free, what the hell, you know? I'm not denying that people wanted to be free because that's the natural nature of man. I'm not, mankind. I'm not saying that. But the idea of a slave, all right, was not anything abnormal to them, any of them, at least initially, and only became an issue as wealth and technology, all right, continued to advance. The people's view of slavery, there were people that were, at least if you were a slave, you weren't starving to death. People looked upon literal starvation to death as being, at least the slave is getting fed. Okay? Believe me when I say that I understand people say, no, there's a lot of people that they'd rather starve than to be slaves. Yeah, and they were pitied. They were often pitied by the very slaves, all right, who were eating.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's not, I'm not justifying slavery, okay? I'm really not. But you cannot take a look at the way we look at the institution of slavery today and have an understanding of the mentality of the society back then. And what's more is we today take for granted that slavery is wrong. These people back then looked at slavery as ubiquitous because it was. Every society had slaves. And that's another thing that people have got to understand. If you were a white person, if you were a white man and you took your family out into the hinterlands, right, to build your farm, and you got captured by the Native Americans, okay, you were expected to be a slave of the Native Americans. Now, normally, the man would be killed. You know, the husband would be killed. The children would be raised as children within the society to a point. It depended upon several factors, obviously. And the women were basically given over to whichever males they deemed to give them over to. And I mean giving them over. Back then, you didn't marry, and that's another thing. Excuse me. Back then, who your husband was often decided for you. Right? Who your spouse was determined in many cases by your parents before you could even speak. That was normal. Right? Now, as the colonial period went on, people started getting into the whole wooing thing and courtship and everything in. But even then, very few people were marrying, quote unquote, for love, and they were marrying for other social reasons. You weren't in love necessarily with your husband or your wife. So these farmers who got captured by the Native Americans, the woman, all right, would be given over to some warrior. She didn't look upon it as, and I know people aren't going to like this, but she didn't look upon it as being raped by a savage. It was the way that her life turned out to be. There was a fatalistic acceptance of life back then as life existed. That's not saying that they would enjoy it. That's not saying they were looking forward to it, or nor does it mean that they wanted it to happen. But it was the life they were now living. It was there was a fatalistic kind of a mindset. There wasn't this mindset, of that as a society where, yeah, you could go out there and make your way in America, but you could also fail. And people understood this, right? And if you failed, the consequences were you were either dead or you were enslaved. And it didn't matter what the color of your skin was, right? And it was after the Bacon Rebellion where the colonial authorities in Virginia, they were the ones that came back and said, well, when he rose up, a lot of the people, it wasn't just blacks that rose with him, it was a lot of whites that rose with him that were in indentured servitude. So what they did is they basically created a system to prevent that from happening again. Why? They wanted the whites and the blacks they wanted to pit them against one another. So they created a system, all right, so that they would always be at each other's throats so that they wouldn't threaten their power. So the guys that created the situation and were abusing the system decided to go, okay, what we'll do is we'll have the different masses of poor fight amongst themselves, and while they're fighting each other, they won't have time to look for us. And this is one of the reasons why blacks became codified in slavery in America, whereas whites were given a social status simply so that they could sit up there in the lower orders, right? Wouldn't threaten the power structure ever again. And the consequence of that, of course, is it leads to the type of America that we have today, right? As we go through. But the idea of slavery back then, if bad things happen to you, you're expected to be a slave. Expected to be a slave. Or you could really go off the deep end, right? And really say, you know what? I want nothing to do with any of you bastards, and then go out in the woods and be a mountain man, right? And the mountain men had their own view of life, but the biggest thing about the mountain men is they didn't want anything to do with society. And when I say they didn't want anything to do with society, I mean they wanted nothing to do with human society. It didn't matter whether it was Native American society, right, or white society, or black society. They wanted just to be left alone. These were people that would go out in the woods by themselves and not see another human for up to 6 months, right? They would literally go out and avoid everyone and just live their lives. And every now and then they would come back, trade their furs, trade their goods, right, that they had for some luxury item that they decided that they needed to have, and then they would go back out in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
People have the wrong view of who the mountain men were. You know, well, the mountain men were just out there trying to make their living and make money. No, they just wanted to get away from everybody. If they wanted to make a living and make money, they became traders. And what I mean by that is they were the ones that created trading posts, right? And they would trade with the other people that would come in and out, right? And they would make money that way. Mountain men had no intention of doing that. Well, they may come in initially and say, hey, I like this, but they've quickly realized that humans suck, right? So they stayed out there. Well, they died. You know, many of them died.
Yeah.
Right.
In all fairness, and I completely agree with TM here, they were the original libertarians. I mean, you sit there and you get people, especially libertarians, that, you know, they say, oh, humanity should do this, we should give up this, know that. That is exactly what the mountain men believed. They may as well have called themselves the mountain men instead of libertarians. And personally, I think actually it's got a certain ring to it.
Well, let's talk about another group that was in a different mindset, but in a similar mindset in a way. And that's the pirates.
Hmm.
The pirates of the day were quite libertarian and very democratic, all right? Also very vicious, all right? And very authoritarian at the same time. What do I mean by that? For example, they would often elect They would hold an election of who their captain was. When a captain died or something, they would hold an election of who their captain was. And whoever became the captain, he was the captain. And the captain's law was whatever the captain said the law rules were, that was the captain's rule. And if you failed to obey the captain, you were as likely to be shot by one of the other pirates, your other fellow pirates, as you were by the captain.
Yeah.
If you argued with the captain and he beat you within an inch of your life, people around there would go, yeah, you deserved it. When the captain said, tie him up to the freaking, to the mast for the whipping, there was plenty of people that would go out there, all right? You couldn't be a mountain man MC. He'd kick your road down the ass. Right? They would tie you, they'd gleefully tie you for being a dirtbag, right? So it was an interesting thing. You know, the pirates themselves were quite interesting, simply because they created a society, and once you broke the societal code, well, you know, keel haul you, right? And keel hauling was horrifying for people who don't know what keel hauling is. Right? Now, normally, what you hear about from keel hauling is you think of people that throw you in the front of the ship and then keel haul you all the way to the back of the ship. All right. So from bow to stern, right? Well, normally you didn't go from bow to stern, mainly because, quite frankly, it was hard to get a rope that would stay underneath like that. If you go from bow to stern, right? You know, the rope's not going to. The rope is going to roll, for example, over, right? So what they did is there were cases where you went from bow to stern because there were ways to do it, but I'm not going to go into those areas. You basically go diagonal. But normally what they would do is you would throw you off the port side and bring you up the stern side, or vice versa, right? Where they would, you would have your feet would be roped, your hands would be roped, all right, on one end, and they would throw you in the water, and they would then pull you all the way underneath the boat up to the other side. Right? Now, normally you die to that process. All right?
No, really? Honestly, I thought they'd be happy with it. I'm shocked, I tell you. Shocked, I say.
Normally you die to the process because when you got keel hauled, the keels that you see in all the movies and the boats, there was something called a barnacle. Many of you people have heard of these things. Right? Well, barnacles on the bottom were something that attached to the bottoms of these ships, and they were basically, they're a type of crustacean kind of thing, right? And you were being pulled through that, right? It wasn't just ropes and splinters and the things that you were getting burned with, right? It wasn't some nice smooth little under the ship you went, right? And plus the fact you had to keep your breath, you had to hold your breath while you're getting dragged through all this.
Yeah.
Right. So keel hauling was a very, very severe punishment. But it was not a punishment that was given lightly, number one, and number two it was very rare. Whipping was normally what it was, right? And whipping is not exactly the punishment some say. Just saying, yes and no. All right. I mean, lashes could be given to you in a variety of manners, right? If you were being whipped, I don't know if any of you have ever been hit with a whip before. I have. Okay. It more than stings, folks. It more than stings. Okay. And it does cut. Okay. A single lash from a whip cuts. Right? Not necessarily deeply, but it does cut. And there were people who were experts, all right, that were assigned to do whippings, all right? It also depended upon if they lashed you. Sometimes it would be with a cane, right? Sometimes it was with things like a cat of nine tails, right? These were all punishments of the day. Yes, punishments for running away as a slave often entailed so much whippings, and after the whippings, they often sold the slave. It's kind of the strangest thing. You capture the slave that escaped, you whip him, and then you sell him to somebody else. Well, what the hell's the point? Keep him as a slave. You know, I mean, I have to look at that. Just kind of shook my head. It's not that I don't understand the reasoning that they did it. All right, it's just that it seems like counterproductive. You know.
One thing I would just like to say here: you're mentioning about this whipping and things like this. In a modern society, that's actually considered a form of pleasure. Just saying.
Well, the kind of whipping that you see happening by the people doing pleasure wasn't the kind of whipping that you see that they got as punishment back in the day. But in society, you could get whipped and lashed, right? When you put you in stocks, right? Sometimes you were sentenced to lashes. And they would whip you, and they would whip you with a variety of different things, depending upon what you were sentenced to. If it was with a cane, it would be caning. Look at what they did. Even today, they do canings, like in certain places, like Singapore, which we think is absolutely outrageous, right? But they're not giving them 10 lashes. They're giving them 70 and 80 lashes at a time with a cane.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the other thing about that is, if you ever get hit with a whip, okay, just to let you know, the whip goes around the contours of your skin, right? And when it hits your back, it can still go around to hit the sides of your ribs, even to the point of coming forward and even to the front part of your rib, right? So whips were a very severe type of a punishment, depending upon how those lashes were given. And if you go to a cat of nine tails, most of the time, what people talk about a cat of nine tails, you didn't have sharp barbs at the end of these things. There were times that there were people that did that. That's not completely true, but that was not the average cat of nine tails. The average cat of nine tails was a series of leather straps, right? Leather that had that were tied in knots, so that the knots were what were hitting you, right? No. Cat of nine tails generally did not have hooks. Some did. The truth is Shirati's right in that regard. Some of those, there were certain times that was done, but that was not something they were going to do in a colonial time frame. They were going to hit you with a rate of whip, right? And they would getting whipped once or twice. It stings, it cuts, and it bleeds for a little bit. But if you take care of it right away, it's not a big deal. If you continue to do this, if you use more than 5 lashes, that's when you're doing real damage to somebody with a whip. Okay, but there were people that were assigned this. You had in society, there were people that had that as their job. They would put the hood on. They were the executioner. Normally, the executioner was also the one who was doing the cat of nine kind of things too, right? And that was part of society. That's the way society was. So the idea that a person got whipped, right, wasn't exclusive to slaves, is what I'm trying to point out. Right? It was an accepted form of punishment. Right? Now, was it more likely that a slave was going to get whipped? Yeah, because the list of things they could do wrong because they were a slave automatically increased. Well, you talk back to the master. Oh, well, that might be enough to get you whipped. Was it ridiculous? Yeah, of course it was. I mean, but the reality is, if you said the wrong thing to the wrong person in the Virginia colony, and you from the aristocracy, it wasn't a surprise that they would get whipped or hit, right? It wasn't a surprise that you was a free. Now you might resent it more, right? There's things that could happen as a result of it, right? People, if you want to talk about the colonial time frame, you had Andrew Jackson, who everyone despises today, right? Andrew Jackson, when he was 13 years old, was captured as while he was in the service of the colonial army, the Revolutionary Army, and while in captivity, a British officer ordered him to shine his shoes, at which point he refused, and the colonial officer hit him with a saber, cut his hand in his face. Okay, this is what life was. This is what life was like when you were being punished. Okay, understand?
Just for a moment, I would like to do for want of better, a suggestion to everyone. Put 1 in the chat if you think that whipping and the Cat of Nine Tails should be brought back as a punishment form. Carry on, sir.
Keel Hawley may work well, if not better than Cat of Nine Tails. Sure, you may lose a crew member, but the rest will be more men to make up for it with renewed effort.
He's right there. Weirdly, that was a form of punishment. It wasn't so much you punishing one person; you was letting everyone know what you're willing to do.
Well, that
oh dear God,
that is an aspect of it. All right. Oh dear God, you're the one who asked.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting quite such a reaction, but actually, I shouldn't really have been confused. I expected this, especially from these people.
It's just that what we look at today, right, in the society that we have today, didn't have the same context, right? And I don't think people even understand that. The idea that slavery was wrong is accepted by the vast majority today. The idea that slavery was wrong in the 1700s was not accepted by everybody. It wasn't even accepted by the majority, right? Let alone the vast majority. It wasn't even accepted by the majority. And the reason is because they didn't have the same view of slavery that we do today. And one of the accusations that was leveled against the northern colonies, right, by the southern colonies concerning slavery was, yeah, you guys don't have slaves because your life is different than ours. That's the only reason. Don't come back and say that you want to make slavery illegal for some moral crusade, because you don't, which is not accurate, all right, in a sense, okay? Because whether people want to believe this or not, the northern colonies were far more religious, all right, than the southern colonies were. The northern colonies were far more pure. They came from the Puritans. They had a Puritan mindset, all right. They were looking at things from a moralistic viewpoint in a lot of cases. I'm not saying that they were ending slavery, and that if they had moved down to the southern colonies, they wouldn't have slaves. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there was a religious component to them, all right, and how they looked at it. whether it was somewhat hypocritical because the conditions in the North were different in the South, and therefore slavery was ineffective in the North in comparison to the South, right? Especially when it came to large plantations. The reason large plantations owned slaves was because they could make it work. Slaves could work in a large plantation type of context. But in the North, you couldn't have plantations. The weather, the ground, the crops, the rotation and everything didn't allow for it. So therefore, you couldn't have vast plantations of slaves. You don't have vast plantations in the North. You don't have huge things. What you have is the average little farmer going out there and farming on its own. Now, part of that had to do with the difference in how the colonies were established, right? But a lot more of it had to do with the fact that the crops that could be successfully used in a plantation type of environment couldn't grow up north. You couldn't grow cotton fields in large swaths of cotton fields in the North. You could in the South. You couldn't grow tobacco in the North. You could in the South. And that's what made the difference, right? That really is what made the plantation system viable in the South, but didn't make it viable in the North, right? It just happened to be the consequences of things. And so you end up with the colonists themselves arguing toward the latter half of the 18th century. That's when you start seeing them start to talk seriously about ending slavery in the North, but the South is so resistant against it. You're going to say something?
No, I was just reading some of the comments, and it's like, do I? No.
No, go ahead. You might as well make the rude comments. Everyone else is going to anyway.
That point. Sorry, it's just the entire group of viewers are complete degenerates in most ways. Yes, just running through it, I would actually have a hard time defining one of these people as socially acceptable. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this to be offensive to anyone, but it's true. And I'd like it noted, I actually love every one of you. I'm perfectly cool with all of it.
Well, I mean, so the people understand this. When the British banned slavery, right, it wasn't until 1833. You know, that's close to 2 generations after the Revolutionary War. So the idea that everyone's has this viewpoint of slavery and what it was like. I mean, even the Constitution, right, recognized that there were issues with slavery, although they didn't go where they knew. Yes, whip me, Pirate Daddy. They didn't go as far as they needed to, and as a result, you condemned. You know, the Constitution in itself condemned the American situation to a civil war. In fact, I think it condemns us to another one. All right, just because of how it's currently written, but that's a separate issue. You know, the thing is even back then, the American Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, outlawed slave trading. All right, outside of the colony, with anyone outside of the colonies after 1830. You couldn't import slaves in from Africa after 1830. Most people don't even know that. Right? So the idea of freeing slaves and all that was beginning to take shape, but the reality was the people at that time still grew up with slavery being perfectly acceptable in all regards. You damn well better want to be. You know, and so when you hear about these things, and the reason I'm discussing this is because people don't understand the life of a slave. Okay, everyone sees the life of the slave, right, as Kunta Kinte, right, in Roots. right? Or Chicken George in Roots. That's what Americans think of as slavery today. You know, maybe Kissy. Right? That's not that situation, right, did not entail all of slavery. It did not encompass slavery even at the time. It's not inaccurate in that these kind of things didn't happen, because these things that they showed, they portrayed in the movie Roots, right, in that little miniseries itself, those things did happen, right? The horrific aspects of slavery existed. Everyone has to understand that. But it's more horrific for us today than it was back then. And the reason was because life sucked back then. Life was so much harder back then. Today you have how many millions of people today have never known a time frame where they've been spanked, let alone slapped, kicked, all right, slugged. Today, a fist fight, right, is an assault. You can't hit people with your fist. An assault back in the 1700s was if you picked up an implement and used it. If you slugged somebody, well, that's just a brawl, right? It really wasn't looked upon as anything horrific, unless, of course, you hit a woman. That was a slightly different issue, right?
Yeah.
If you were a woman beater and you were lower than scum, right? It was a different view. Life was different then. So you hear things that people can't even imagine today. For example, one of the slaves that George Washington purchased, right, his manservant. He purchased him as a manservant. For all intents and purposes, that man was his best friend for his life. That man followed Washington into battle. And that man would have followed Washington into battle even if he wasn't a slave. Because their friendship was that tight. The people don't even recognize that. There were, even during the Civil War, where things had changed dramatically for slaves. The plantation system that was implemented due to the advance of the cotton gin, et cetera, all right, really brought out the worst about slavery. It really did. But the thing is that even during that time frame, you had black slaves go out on the battlefields, right, after a battle, to pick up their dead master to take him home. Okay? Because the slaves were not treated always as if they were a whipping post. I'm not justifying slavery, but that's only one aspect of it. And the mentality that we have today doesn't, I'm just trying to point out, it just does not match what was going on back then. And I think that one of the problems that I have is there's too many people today that are trying to judge the past, all right, that way. They're trying to judge the past from a 20th century morality that you cannot do. You are denigrating some of these men, specifically, we're going to talk about Jefferson, right? We're going to talk about all the aspects of Jefferson, right? But you can't look at the man and say, well, he was a slave owner, so therefore he's a horrific individual who should have been, taken out and shot. That's my main point why I'm driving that point home. Different world.
Yeah.
Now, I want you, if you don't mind, Jensen, talking a little bit about the aristocratic system, all right, as it existed in Britain at the time. Not in America, but in Britain.
No, certain. Okay, right. Well, we have over here effectively three classes. I mean, technically, you can modify it slightly, but basically, you have three classes. You have the nobles, the elite, the royals, etc., which are all classed as one thing quite simply. You have the middle class, and you have the lower or working class. Now, to make life a lot easier, the working class quite like the upper class because, after all, lower class knows where it is, upper class are in charge. We're okay with this. Upper class quite likes the lower class. You've got to have somebody doing the work, get on with it, peasant. And then you've got the middle class, which both sides despise with a passion. I would point out that America calls its working class the middle class, and its upper class would be our middle. To put it bluntly, you don't actually have an upper class as we would put it. Now, back then, it was very much looked at. The middle class would be defined as the merchant class, whereas the upper class, well, to put it bluntly, you could be upper class and have absolutely no money whatsoever. It's just that you were looked after by those in that class because, well, to put it bluntly, you're upper class. It's where you're meant to be. The thought of someone upper class falling to the lower class was truly horrific. And of course, the upper class would stamp on the fingers of the middle class that were trying to get up there. In in the old world, we have a thing. I mean, you guys have it now, but nouveau riche. We hate them. We despise them with a passion for one simple reason. They are basically lower and middle class that think that there's something special because they have money, whereas the upper class look down on them at something below lower class purely for the simple fact that at least a lower class knows its job. What are we going to do with this? And yes, I know I've repeated myself. That is a good way of putting it. I would say that pretty much covered the basics. You know,
I think it's important to know the difference because the idea of pedigree being an aspect of society, right, doesn't percolate down here. When I say down here in America, right? Who your dad is, right? Only, or who your grandfather was, right? Really doesn't mean a whole lot to people, right? In a larger context, right? Unless you can go back and try and trace, of course, your ancestry back to not someone that came over in the Mayflower. No one cares about that. But if you can track your lineage back to, let's say, look, I'm related to Benjamin Franklin, then people will, oh, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of cool, right? You'll get that attaboy, but it doesn't give you anything else, right? Mm-hmm. If you're related to George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or any of these guys, any of the founding fathers, you get an attaboy. It's kind of interesting, right? It might get you a drink at a bar, right? But that's about it, right? Because it has nothing to do with who you are. And that was the whole point of coming to America, is for that indentured servant. Many of the people came over, understand, many people came over, and some people who came over even as slaves, right? And this is true of Black Americans who were royally screwed, all right, by the Dred Scott decision. And we'll talk about that at another later date, right? But there were people, there were many people, all right, who came over basically as slaves, and their families made it. Their families made it to the point where they were rich, right, and well off. Most of the people that came over from the Mayflower, well, quite frankly, didn't have a pot to piss in. There's a reason that term exists when you're talking about chamber pots.
Mm-hmm.
It was so poor, you didn't even have a chamber pot, right? Which meant you had to go out outside to poop and shit and pee, all right, in the middle of the winter, all right, without any clothes or anything. You had to pull your drawers down. And if you didn't have a piss to pot in, or a pot to piss in rather, then, you didn't have an outhouse probably.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just, it gives you a different, America was a different land. Now, so when people talk about treatments and how people are treated, the colonists treated the Native Americans poorly. Really? Did they? From whose standpoint? From the standpoint of the fact that the Native Americans no longer have the land that they quote unquote once ruled. Okay, if you want to look at it from that standpoint, sure, you can make that claim from that standpoint, but that's a 20th century evaluation of the situation. That's not the way that was being looked upon by them during that time frame. And when I say them, I'm talking about all of them, including the Native Americans.
Well, in fact, technically, that was actually their lifestyle. So technically, it could actually be argued you just copied the way they did things. After all, taking another tribe's X, where X is equal to their land, their people, their wealth, whatever, was considered how it was done, quite simply.
If you were a powerful tribe, you took from the lower tribes. If your tribe got its ass kicked, well, you may be upset about it. You may want to defend your tribe, right? You may want to rise up and rule over and say, we will rise again, like the South, right? You may have bitterness of the fact that they butchered your dad and they butchered your brothers, right? And they took your sisters and they basically destroyed your tribe. You might have that viewpoint, but did it bother you when you did the same thing to them? 20 years before or 30 years before, or your tribe had done that to them to get to where you were? No, it didn't. It was the way everyone lived. This mentality of all societies have the right to exist. Really? When did that view come into play? It wasn't in the 1700s. It was certainly it wasn't even in the 1800s. The idea that another group of people who wanted to live their lives the way they wanted to live, all right, and that you had no right to ruling over them is a modern concept. Otherwise, you had every right to rule over them. Look at where you're at. We're superior to them, so therefore we have the right to rule. Common concept, folks. Common concept back then. We live in a different world today. We don't have the mindset for the people back then. We do not have it of what it was like. And so this is one, and like I said, I'm not justifying slavery, right, in any way, shape, or form, because quite frankly, one of the problems with slavery has to do with work ethic. Okay, sure, it has to do with being able to produce. When you're a slave, while there were slaves that were better off than other slaves and probably, were more loving and so forth of the situation than others, that doesn't mean that on average they were as productive as someone who was free and intentionally engaging in that same activity was. Agriculture, for example. When people talk about agriculture, people talk about this is something else. In Great Britain, you guys had, because of how your system developed due to the Norman invasions, due to the Viking invasions and everything, right? The ideas of serfdom was already almost gone by the time during the colonial period.
Mm-hmm.
It existed, but not in the same sense, right? And it was not the average person was not a serf. You couldn't say that about France. You couldn't say that about anywhere else, right? Except for probably Spain, but that's only because the majority of the population in Spain in the Spanish Empire included Latin America, right? So they didn't qualify as serfs. They didn't even qualify as anything. They were qualified only as subjects to be grazed upon, right? But the idea of serfs, the vast majority of Europe were serfs, right? But being a serf, the only advantage a serf had in comparison to being a slave, right, was that you couldn't be moved off the land that you were tilling. That's it. And that's really not necessarily a... They didn't invade, they liberated with enthusiasm.
Had to be done. It had to be done. Nice one, Carl.
Well, Carl, I'm sorry, but the liberation that they were doing meant generally liberating someone's head from their shoulders. that was kind of the liberation they were practicing. I don't really...
It's still technically liberation. I can't disagree with him.
But the being a serf meant that didn't mean you couldn't be sold, because the land that you were on got sold. You got sold to somebody else, right? Whereas being a slave meant that you were mobile property, right, and could be sold from this master to that master, or this mistress to that mistress, right? Whereas the serf, you either got purchased or not purchased when the land got purchased. You were you weren't even a human, to be honest. You were just part of the land, right? Now, slaves weren't treated as humans either. They're treated as property as well, right? So but that mindset was already going away in Great Britain for the most part. The ideas of serfs, right, became different, and I think a lot of that had to do really with the Magna Carta. And this is something people don't understand, right? The vast majority of British couldn't read or write. Definitely couldn't even read the Magna Carta, because it was written. Wasn't the Magna Carta written in French?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. See, they couldn't even read that, because it wasn't even in a language that they even understood.
Right? Wasn't a real language anyway. Sorry, Carol.
But the concept, all right, the concept changed the dynamic, all right, because it broke the view of powerlessness of the commoner, right? More than anything else, it broke the power of the aristocracy, in that commoners had power. Up to that point, commoners never had power. Right? If you were a common person, if you were not part of that pedigree set, you had zero power. The Magna Carta broke that and said, no, there's power that exists outside of the aristocracy. Outside of the nobles do not have the monopoly on power. That was the change. Okay, and it was done for a lot of reasons, and a lot of people engaged in it with the wrong ideas about how it was going to turn out. All right. When they signed the Magna Carta, a lot of people were not looking at the things at the how this was all going to turn out. The king, all right, did agreed to it, agreed to give the commoners power because he saw it as a way of limiting his nobles, right? The nobles agreed to it because they saw it as a way to limit the power of the king. Neither one of them had the idea that somehow that the commoners would eventually become, the parliament will become, sovereign. Neither one of them looked at it that way when they signed the Magna Carta. A lot of people don't even understand that. That's what makes the Magna Carta such an important document, because it was codified, right? It was codified that the commoners had power, right? In America, that isn't even a thought. Okay, when America is going through, as the colonies are going through this, the idea of your pedigree, all right, has no bearing in the colonies themselves. It's who you are yourself that gives you power. Are you a great man or aren't you? All right. You have people like Benjamin Franklin. But Benjamin Franklin, for all intents and purposes, right, in America, was going to be treated like they would treat any European nobility. He wasn't going to be treated any differently than any European nobility that came over. In America, he wasn't going to be treated any differently. He was treated as royalty in that regard, even though he wasn't royal, right? Because we didn't look at it that way. How could a royal be treated? What were you going to give? In America, what were you going to give royalty? What were you going to give them? The only thing you could give them in America would have been your loyalty. Well, you saw what happened with that.
That one will.
Well, honestly, I mean, people were going to be loyal would be loyal to what was said of Benjamin Franklin to a point, right? I mean, he was considered a great man, but he wasn't considered their sovereign. He wasn't considered their that he had divine right to rule over them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we've been talking for an hour and a half now.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this because when we talk about Jefferson, we're gonna dive deep into Thomas Jefferson next week, if that's okay with you, Jensen.
Of course.
And we're really going to go into the things because Jefferson is a complicated individual, and if you just look at him through the 2D caricature of the fact he was a slave owner, all right, you're going to miss the greatness and the weaknesses of the man in totality. Because that's another thing that about America. The one thing Americans did do well during the Revolutionary War and the creation of the Constitution was the fact that there was an understanding that we're human beings and we all have failings. And we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about who he was, right? And the kind of person that he was in a larger context, and so forth. But I'll hold off because there's a lot of things about Thomas Jefferson. It was a very complicated individual.
Yes. Well, assuming you're bringing this to a pause, would you like to advertise the stream you're going to be going on soon?
I will. Okay. I this afternoon at in an hour and a half or so, I will be on Irate Prostate stream where he's going to do an interview for me, or of me rather, I should say, which should be interesting. Right, for those of you who want to hear who I am and my thoughts as a regular person rather than as a personality, right? I think it will be an interesting discussion with Irate Prostate because some of the questions I kind of expect him to ask are because he asks everybody certain questions, right? I think will enlighten certain people about who I am because I am not just the angry man yelling at clouds that Wolfshot, what it was the term has given me, the caricature she created for me. Although Wolfshot does that in all good fun and everything, and I love Wolfshot from that. Right. I'm glad that she's still doing okay, but I wish I wish things were better for her, to be honest. But the situation that she's in, I mean, nobody wants to get shot. The fact that she had to get shot is terrible. Had to, I shouldn't say had to, that she was shot by a robber.
The joys of living in a modern society. Well, I think we'll leave it there. So, as I'm sure you understand, next week we're going to be dealing with Thomas Jefferson, also known as the man who banged his slaves. So, I hope to see people next week, and I hope you all learned something. Anything you want to say, MC?
Nope, sounds good. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.